Robservations with Meyer Burnett.
Now, I'm going to read my first letter, and this is a good one. This one comes from Jim Boyette. Hey, Rob. Really enjoy your show and your defense of Kathleen Kennedy. It's bizarre to me that people would react with such vitriol to her work. Like you say, even if the movies are bad, it's not like she set out to make them that way. Even weirder is the idea that there is some correct way that they should have been made, that everyone would agree on. I didn't care for The Last Jedi, but the only part I did like was seeing Skywalker's jaded disillusionment and regrets. I hated The Force Awakens. I'd rather watch the Ewok Adventure and Ewoks Battle for Endor back to back. To me, Star Wars is a franchise with special problems for anyone wanting to expand it. The original trilogy is a fairy tale and a story of the hero's journey. It has this mythical quality that is very hard to maintain over the long term. For example, Snow White has to end with happily ever after. If we follow Snow White and Prince Charming 20 years in the future and see that they've both gotten fat and are screaming at each other over who gets to control the remote, it's no longer a fairy tale. Back in the 90s, when I read the Timothy Zahn trilogy, I already had the sense that even though those books were great, the more we knew about the Star Wars universe, the more that all-important mythical quality degenerated. It's not like the Star Trek universe, which can sustain all sorts of stories of varying degrees of verisimilitude. I felt that most strongly in watching Rogue One. I don't think the Star Wars universe can sustain a story about realistic political intrigue. The moment things starts getting realistic, I start asking questions about the underlying premises of the universe that never bothered me in the original trilogy. In the 1977 Star Wars, the Death Star is a powerful symbol of the destructiveness of the Empire. But in Rogue One, since we're watching what purports to be a realistic portrayal of political intrigue, espionage, and the accompanying moral quandaries, I start asking questions appropriate to such a story. Like, for example, why would the Empire go to the trouble of building a Death Star just to destroy a planet? Can't they just drop hydrogen bombs on it? I mean, we here on Earth have the capacity to totally destroy a planet too. Big deal. In retrospect, something else that made Star Wars so magical back in the 80s was scarcity. There were only 3 movies. After that, the comics and less than a dozen novels, including the film novelizations, and the Ewok TV movies. But we all know those really didn't count. Even the Christmas special used to be shrouded in mystery because it was so hard to find, at least growing up in Arkansas. I finally bought a bootleg VHS tape in Tokyo in 2001 for like $100. I guess I'm a sucker for anything with B. Arthur. The Star Wars universe was so tantalizing precisely because the original trilogy did a good job of seeding the stories with tangential mysteries, such as what the Clone Wars were all about, what the history was between Han and Lando, exactly how Luke and Leia had been separated at birth, etc. Because these mysteries were tangential to the main plot lines, the movies didn't need to resolve them, and they sparked your imagination enough to pull you through multiple viewings. Even if you had every frame of the movie memorized, there was so much you didn't know that had happened off-screen that the movie only hinted at. I imagine it would be hard to maintain this sense of vast mystery if the franchise is putting out a film or two a year. Anyway, thanks for listening to my rambling thoughts. Excelsior, Jay Boyette. Well, Jim, I totally agree with you. One of that was always the funny thing. He fought in the Clone Wars, and that bounty hunter we ran into on Orb Mantell changed my mind. All of that stuff. You're absolutely right. I mean, it was all of that world building that was going on just in the background with somebody making an offhanded comment. And you're like, what? And what's interesting is that all of those offhanded comments are the first things people glom onto when they want to tell further Star Wars stories. What I've found really interesting is that I've never understood why, to inspire Star Wars or Star Trek or any of our great franchises, that people don't now do what George Lucas did. George Lucas went back and he was like, oh, I want to, the Jedi are basically samurai knights, and I'm going to look at movies like Hidden Fortress or Kurosawa's other samurai films and for inspiration. And for the space battles, I'm going to go back to World War II, and I'm going to cut in footage famously of the Dam Busters to show what these battles will eventually look like. But now everything, and Star Trek to a certain extent has become this way too. Like, no one is looking outside the Star Wars or the Star Trek franchise. Like, if you look at Balance of Terror, one of the best episodes of the original Star Trek in the first season that Willow wrote such an eloquent review of, when you watch that, it's clearly a submarine. It was inspired by submarine warfare and submarine movies. I mean, clearly, it literally is a shameless ripoff, but set in a science fiction context with social commentary at the same time. But when I see modern Star Trek, like Discovery, not to just rip on Discovery again, but it just came into my mind. And if I have an opportunity to rip on horrible writing, wherever I see it, it's always a good opportunity. The latter half of Star Trek Discovery season 2 was a mishmash of half-baked science fiction ideas that have been around since the dawn of time. Ooh, an evil AI that wants to get rid of humanity, and time travel in a weird suit. None of that made sense at all. And yet, because you have writers that understand the superficial nature of these things, but have no real understanding of the larger ramifications. One of the great things about, I think, reading novels, especially science fiction novels, is the extrapolation that occurs when you have a great world building. Somebody sits down and says, okay, if this is true, then there is a million different things that make it true. And one of the things that George R.R. Martin would do in Game of Thrones in his novels is he'd come up with something very simple, but then work that idea backwards to where we got to, how it got to the present. When I was a kid, when I was in junior high school, I was shown a program which still to this day is one of my favorite programs that I've ever seen. And there's a British historian named James Burke. James Burke. And he had a show called Connections. And what was so great about Connections is James Burke would start it, and he had this very affable voice. And look, anybody who had a British accent, I would listen to and immediately was smarter than I was. If it was a, more of an upscale, not like Cockney rhyming slang or something like that, but the Oxford kind of. I mean, that's why I believe that all of the imperial officers, like Peter Cushing, of course, he was evil because he was diabolically smart because he was British. I just thought that was the way of the world. So when you'd watch Connections, it would start out like 2,000 years ago, and they would talk about how the ancient Romans created aqueducts, or they were able to get water into people's homes. And it would start with that invention, and it would go through time, and you would see how one thing led to another, led to another, led to another across literally centuries, if not millennia. And then it would end with a nuclear bomb, and you never knew. And as a kid, I would eat this up. And I first saw this, they were showing this to us. There was a teacher I had named Mr. Wall. And we had, it was like a gifted child program called ELP, the Extended Learning Program. Now they probably wouldn't have that in school for fear of offending the kids that weren't part of that program. Like, God forbid any children who are exceptional can be catered to, because everybody's equal now, right? But anyway, so I would watch this and I would be fascinated. Not only was I fascinated from a story standpoint, because it was like a historical mystery. Like, where's it going to wind up? You always wanted to know, like, where was it going to go? It had something inherently built into it, which was the conclusion. Like, where was James Burke going to take you on this journey? And then they did I think a Connections 2 series years later, but I've frankly never sat down and watched it. But that always sort of struck me. And the Star Wars franchise and the Star Trek franchise, one of, I think, the appeals, especially of Star Trek, was the answers of they didn't even bring up these questions. We as fans would bring up these questions and sort of run them down. And one of the great joys of being a Star Trek fan, like if you're reading Star Trek novels, is that the best Star Trek novelists would be like, okay, if this situation exists here, how did this situation happen? And the best Star Trek novelists, and I include people like Diane Duane, like the Reeve Stevens, Judy and Garr, like Christopher Bennett, like Dayton Ward, like David Mack. I mean, people that really understand the Star Trek universe are also, they really put the the screws down to develop a backstory, and it's a lot of fun. And I think that's one of the great appeals of these franchises. And with Star Trek and Star Wars, it gets a little, I guess, annoying to the fan base when the things that are presented aren't things that track with what have come before. To me, and I include that in my word verisimilitude, which is one of my favorite words. So yeah, anyway, I've kind of lost my train of thought on that, but I don't even know where I was going with all that, to be honest. But thank you for your letter, Jim.